Prejudice is often caused in part by evading certain relevant facts. It certainly is in the case of Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice in regard to both Mr. Wickham and Mr. Darcy, and we can learn a lot from Lizzie's example. As in the case of many Jane Austen novels, the story is so delightful we almost don't notice the lesson. But if we focus on it a bit, we can not only improve our own lives, we can properly appreciate Jane Austen's genius in working a moral lesson into her wonderful story. At the climax of the story, after reading the letter Mr. Darcy gives her after his first proposal, Lizzie, quote, grew absolutely ashamed of herself. Of neither Darcy nor Wickham could she think without feeling she had been blind, partial, prejudiced, absurd. What brought Lizzie, who is normally quite playful and content, to the point of thinking such things? It's the realization that she had been biased for Wickham and against Darcy by how they'd treated her when she first met them. As a result, she evaded bad things about Wickham and good things about Darcy and made judgments where she didn't really have the information to do so. Now, evasion, I want to be clear, is not the same thing as ignorance. Evasion is when you know something but you disregard it and don't apply it to your thinking or decisions. And there's usually some kind of motivation or reason you do this, though it might be subconscious. As philosopher Ayn Rand wrote, a person, quote, is free to evade reality. He is free to unfocus his mind and stumble blindly down any road he pleases, but not free to avoid the abyss he refuses to see, end quote. Now, in Lizzie's case, the road she's stumbling down is moral judgments, positive in the case of Wickham, negative in the case of Darcy, which leads her to make decisions that affect hers and her family's futures and happiness, and the abyss is the regret and complications that result from decisions based on those judgments. Her motivation is to maintain the comfortable idea that the charming man who flattered her was good, and the proud man who scorned her was bad. We all want to believe that we like people who are good and dislike people who are bad, that we are good judges of character. But for that to be the case, we cannot evade relevant facts, as Lizzie learns. However, Pride and Prejudice is a Jane Austen novel, so her situation is not irredeemable. Love conquers all in the end, and everything is eventually put right. Nevertheless, there's a lot to be learned from Lizzie's case, so let's break down how she dealt with Mr. Wickham and Mr. Darcy separately to see precisely how it worked in her case and what lessons we can learn from it. From the first time we meet Mr. Wickham, he's charming. He's an officer in the militia, and he's described as attractive and having a, quote, very pleasing address when introduced to Lizzie and her sisters, and he's very happy to chat with them all. The next time Lizzie meets him is when some of the officers and the Bennet sisters are invited to their aunt and uncle's house for a dinner party. There, Mr. Wickham is the man every lady has her eye on, but he singles out Lizzie to sit by and talk to. Though it is only their second meeting, he tells her a whole sob story about how Mr. Darcy denied him his inheritance despite his close relationship with Mr. Darcy's late father. At the time, Lizzie is flattered by his interest and trust in her, and ready to believe Mr. Darcy is even worse than she initially thinks him to be. But later, she realizes that even if it had been true, the situation was far too personal to be shared on a second meeting, and could only have been shared with the intent of making her feel bad for him. Lizzie, to her credit, is inclined to believe Mr. Wickham's story, but she still asks around. Miss Bingley, the sister of Mr. Darcy's friend Mr. Bingley, who is clearly in love with Mr. Darcy and contemptuous of Lizzie, tells her that the story isn't true, but that Miss Bingley doesn't know the details. So Lizzie brushes off Miss Bingley's admittedly biased account, thinking her, quote, willfully ignorant of Mr. Darcy's bad behavior. This is a tricky case. Miss Bingley is definitely prejudiced in favor of Mr. Darcy. However, she has also spent a lot more time with him than Lizzie has, and thus has more information on his behavior and perhaps on this particular situation than Lizzie does. But Lizzie totally disregards her comment. It can be tempting to disregard information from sources we have good reason to believe are themselves biased, but if we want to discover truth and be able to make decisions that will best affect our lives, we must be careful to avoid confirmation bias, acting as though we are seeking information but only paying attention to the information that supports what we want to believe. This is what Lizzie is doing, but it's very common in real life as well. Whether on political issues, relationships, or our careers, it's tempting but destructive to ignore the uncomfortable evidence that we may be wrong about something. To elaborate on the career example a bit, imagine you become attached to working at a specific company, believing it to be your dream job. You might then disregard reports from disgruntled employees, inappropriate questions at the job interview, comments during training that indicate it's not going to be a great fit, and a work culture even in your early days that is unhealthy or simply not right for you.
You form your opinion instead based on employees who are nice to you, the plush office, the great pay, and the fancy job title.
The longer you stay in that job, the more it affects your mental health and maybe even your physical health, and the less time you're spending building a career that really is good for you. This is just one way confirmation bias can be self-destructive. The next instance of Lizzie disregarding red flags about Wickham comes when her aunt, Mrs. Gardiner, warns her not to get too attached to him. The officer has little money, and Lizzie has only a small inheritance, but nevertheless it would be an improvement over his current fortunes. Mrs. Gardner's warning seems to be very prescient when Wickham, though still friendly, stops pursuing Lizzie and instead begins to court a girl who has recently and unexpectedly inherited a lot of money. Lizzie is not terribly upset because she wasn't deeply in love with Wickham, but what's of note here is that she's quite forgiving of Wickham's apparent interest in marrying for money, whereas it nearly ended her friendship with Charlotte Lucas when that lady married Mr. Collins, despite not actually being in love with him. She's not exactly evading the facts of the situation, but she is evading the reasons behind this double standard. She believes love to be a necessary prerequisite for a happy marriage. This seems obvious today, but it wasn't taken for granted in Regency-era England. But Lizzie is willing to overlook that belief in the case of the young man she admires, even though she doesn't really know him all that well. She wants him to be the good guy, so she ignores what should be red flags and forgives what she doesn't forgive in others, letting her desires and her emotions get in the way of her understanding of the facts. This all changes when she gets Mr. Darcy's letter explaining, among other things, the true history of what happened between Mr. Wickham and himself. It was not that Mr. Darcy denied him the post of clergyman at the Pemberley parish that the late Mr. Darcy had promised him, but that Mr. Wickham rejected it, and further, tried to elope with Mr. Darcy's sister, Georgiana, which would have destroyed the young lady's reputation. Lizzie's first reaction to this is shock and rejection. Quote, she wished to discredit it entirely, repeatedly exclaiming, "This must be false. This cannot be. This must be the grossest falsehood." But Lizzie is too honest to totally disregard Mr. Darcy's account. She goes over it again and again, carefully trying to be impartial. She even looks for any first-hand evidence of Mr. Wickham being morally good in her experience of him. Quote, she tried to recollect some instance of goodness, some distinguished trait of integrity or benevolence that might rescue him from the attacks of Mr. Darcy, or at least, by the predominance of virtue, atone for those casual errors under which she would endeavor to class what Mr. Darcy had described as the idleness and vice of many years' continuance. But no such recollection befriended her. In fact, as she thinks back over Mr. Wickham's behavior, she finds multiple instances of his words not matching up with his actions. He told her he wasn't afraid of meeting Mr. Darcy, but then left town rather than attend a ball they'd both been invited to. He told Lizzie he didn't want to ruin Mr. Darcy's reputation, but once Mr. Darcy leaves the area, he tells everyone the same lie he'd told Lizzie about Mr. Darcy cheating him out of his inheritance, and so on. Lizzie is eventually forced to admit that her vanity had been flattered by Mr. Wickham and offended by Mr. Darcy, so she had evaded several facts about both. Of course, there were some things she couldn't have known, such as his attempt to elope with Miss Darcy. But if she had kept her distance and encouraged him less, she would have been less disappointed and embarrassed by the truth, and also would have more actively discouraged Lydia's interest in him, which of course leads to disastrous consequences for the whole family. Evasion may make things easier in the short term, but definitely not in the long term. It is of course very natural to be flattered when a charming or dazzling person shows a particular interest in us, but we have to remember that emotions are a reflection of what we value, not what we know. If we value others' opinions of us, we react positively to a good opinion and negatively to a bad one. That's understandable. But where we can err is if we forget that this reaction tells us about our own values in the context of the situation, an internal truth, rather than about another person or the external world more generally. It is our reasoning minds looking at and interpreting the facts that enables us to discover truth. If we evade relevant information, we're not letting our minds do what they're supposed to do. A very similar process, sort of in reverse, is in operation between Lizzie and Mr. Darcy. The first time Lizzie meets Mr. Darcy is at a ball, and he's quite standoffish. He only talks to the people he came with, and when his friend Mr. Bingley tries to get him to dance and points out that Lizzie, who's nearby, isn't dancing with anyone, Mr. Darcy replies that she is tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt me. Lizzie overhears and understandably is offended. Others amongst her social circle also thought that he was arrogant at the ball, and this sets her opinion of him for quite a long time. The next time they are at a social gathering together, Mr. Darcy, perhaps in an attempt to make up for it, asks her to dance with him, and she declines. The next significant interaction after that is at Netherfield, Mr. Bingley's home, when Lizzie's sister Jane is ill and recovering there, and Lizzie comes to look after her. She spends 4 days there and interacts with Mr. Darcy often. They banter a bit, and Mr. Darcy is quite taken by her wit, her easy playfulness, the intelligence of her face, her figure, and her care in coming to look after her sister. He begins to soften towards her. For example, when they and 2 others are walking in the grounds, and the others choose a path that's only wide enough for 3 to walk comfortably on, excluding Lizzie, Mr. Darcy suggests going to a wider path so all 4 can walk together. Lizzie also notices one evening how often he's looking at her, and is confused. She never suspects he may like her, but can't understand why he keeps looking if he only means to find fault. She doesn't think of this again, and evades the possibility that, despite his proud demeanor, he does in fact like her. Later, when she is visiting her friend Charlotte at Hunsford, and he is visiting his aunt at Rosings across the street, they meet each other many times. There is a secluded path Lizzie enjoys walking on, and when she meets Mr. Darcy on it, she tells him it is her favorite, in the hopes that he will avoid it going forward. But he doesn't, and she meets him on it a few more times. Again, she dismisses this as an eccentricity of character, and thus she is shocked when he proposes to her at Hunsford, and rejects the proposal in no uncertain terms. She tells him why she dislikes him, and the next day he gives her the letter that is intended to explain all. Here again, she was evading pieces of evidence that don't fit with the narrative she has constructed, and is not allowing for the fact that people's opinions can change. Not everyone sticks rigidly to their first impression as she has done. It's quite rational to adjust your opinion of someone as you gather more evidence, and that is what Mr. Darcy is doing. Once Lizzie has read Mr. Darcy's letter, as mentioned above, she is at first in shock and doesn't want to believe it. But just as she tries to objectively consider Mr. Wickham's behavior, so she tries to consider Mr. Darcy's. Quote, proud and repulsive as were his manners, she had never, in the whole course of their acquaintance, an acquaintance which had latterly brought them much together and given her a sort of intimacy with his ways, seen anything that betrayed him to be unprincipled or unjust, anything that spoke him of irreligious or immoral habits, that among his own connections he was esteemed and valued, that even Wickham had allowed him merit as a brother, and that she had often heard him speak so affectionately of his sister as to prove him capable of some amiable feeling. She had been offended and put off by Mr. Darcy's pride, and here it's worth noting the difference between pride and arrogance. Pride can be earned. If you have achieved something, you deserve to feel proud of it. If you have built up a good moral character, you should be proud of that, and be careful who you become close to because some people will try to take advantage of you. And in the context of his money and social status, there are many who might try to take advantage of Mr. Darcy. But arrogance is when pride slips into an unwarranted belief in one's superiority and an unearned contempt for others, and this is where rudeness and disregarding of people who might actually bring value to your life can happen, as it does for Mr. Darcy. In his case, in the first part of the book he mixes pride and arrogance, but in the second part, after being told off by Lizzie, he rethinks his behavior and manages to restrict himself to a more appropriate level of pride. In any case, it's understandable why Lizzie is put off by his behavior, but she then allows that bias to get in the way of her noticing and considering the facts of how he behaves after their first meeting, which leads her to angrily reject, at least at first, what would have been a very advantageous marriage in terms of money, social status, and how she's treated. There's also the matter of how Lizzie reacts to the story of Mr. Darcy supposedly cheating Mr. Wickham out of his inheritance, which was the post of clergyman. Because she was flattered by Wickham and offended by Darcy, she's inclined to take Wickham's word for how the whole situation went down. This makes her totally unjust to Mr. Darcy. She doesn't evade any facts in this scenario per se. Until she gets Mr. Darcy's letter, she actually doesn't have the facts or any source she could go to for more information, at least not in a socially acceptable way. But she believes the story Mr. Wickham tells her, while evading the fact that she doesn't have enough evidence to really judge the story one way or the other, besides the character of the two men involved, which, as I've already covered, she's been somewhat blind to. Acknowledging when you don't know enough to decide one way or the other is a kind of wisdom. It's something a lot of people refer to as intellectual humility, which means admitting when you don't know something or can't be certain about it. I prefer to call this intellectual honesty because humility sometimes involves being less confident than you ought to be and even deferring to others' judgment when your own is sufficient. But whatever you call it, it's undoubtedly the case that to make rational judgments based on truth, we need to know when we don't know enough to do so, which is part of Lizzie's mistake here. The key lesson from all of this is that it's easy to let our emotions and our biases blind us to the facts, but doing so can lead to lost opportunities and even heartbreak. In Pride and Prejudice, this is mainly shown in regards to romantic relationships, but it also applies to friendships, family relationships, and, as discussed, jobs. To avoid this, psychologist Nathaniel Branden recommended actively trying to live consciously, which he described as, quote, to seek to be aware of everything that bears on our actions, purposes, values, and goals, to the best of our ability, whatever that ability may be, and to behave in accordance with that which we see and know. As Lizzie's experience shows, doing our best to be aware of all the relevant facts is absolutely essential to making the choices that will help us to create a happy life, as she eventually does.